I think my mother did exactly the right thing. I think it's absolutely extraordinary.
Princess Anne did not raise her voice. She did not summon the press, issue a dramatic warning, or ask the family for permission. She simply placed a signed instruction on the Balmoral estate manager's desk and made one devastating decision unmistakably clear. Camilla's relatives were no longer permitted to use the late Queen's private Scottish residence. By the time the Queen Consort learned what had happened, the gates had already been ordered shut, and the family battle had begun. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne had acted with chilling precision. Her order told Balmoral's estate management that Camilla's children, grandchildren, siblings, and guests could not enter the late Queen's residence without written approval from senior bloodline royals. Balmoral was not simply another royal property. It was Elizabeth's Scottish refuge, where she escaped public duty, carried private grief, and protected family customs she believed belonged to the crown rather than one household, without warning, mercy, or room for appeal. Camilla learned the truth while reviewing plans for a family weekend. An aide entered quietly and explained that the guest rooms assigned to her relatives would remain closed. She removed her glasses, set them beside the schedule, and asked, "Anne signed this herself?" The answer came softly, "Yes." The Queen Consort looked at the crossed-out names, understanding that the decision was not merely practical. It was personal, and everyone around her would know it. Anne remained inside the estate office, watching rain slide down the window as staff reversed security requests, canceled room preparations, and stopped luggage arrangements. She knew the order would be judged as an attack on Camilla. Yet the Princess Royal felt something heavier than anger. She believed allowing the visit without limits would betray her mother's memory and weaken the boundary between royal inheritance and private entitlement. Charles knew nothing until the estate manager requested clarification. The king received the signed instruction in his study and read every line without speaking. When he reached his sister's name, he lowered the page, pressed his thumb against the desk, and told his private secretary, "No statement. Not yet." He had not approved the order. He had not been consulted. Now his wife's humiliation and his sister's resolve had collided directly before him. The gates had closed in one morning, but Anne's decision had begun much earlier. Behind it lay resentment, memory, and a deeper argument over who truly belonged inside the late Queen's sacred refuge. To understand why she risked confronting Camilla and trapping Charles between them, the people behind Balmoral's locked gates must first be understood. The argument was never truly about bedrooms, guest lists, or a weekend in Scotland. It was about who belonged inside the late Queen's most private world after her death. For Anne, Balmoral remained sacred ground, filled with memories no official inventory could measure. For Camilla, exclusion from that world felt like a public declaration that her marriage had brought her close to the crown, but never fully inside the family that guarded it. Anne carried Balmoral differently from everyone else. The Princess Royal remembered childhood rides across the estate, private conversations with her mother, and the final years when duty seemed to steal more and more ordinary time from them. Balmoral had been the place where the late monarch could set aside ceremony and simply breathe. Protecting it now felt like protecting the last untouched part of that relationship. To Anne, surrendering control of those rooms would mean allowing memory itself to be rewritten. Camilla saw the same house through another wound. The Queen Consort believed her family had stood beside her through years of judgment, ridicule, and public rejection. Yet they were still treated as people who could be invited close, but never truly welcomed. Her children and grandchildren were not working royals, meaning they held no official duties on behalf of the crown, but they were still part of her life. Occasional access to Balmoral felt like recognition that her marriage had joined two families, not merely two individuals. Camilla sat alone after her aide left and looked down at the handwritten weekend schedule. Each room had been carefully assigned. Each name carried the promise of a rare private gathering. Then she took up a pen and drew a line through them one by one. Anger hardened her expression at first, but hurt soon replaced it. The order did not simply cancel a visit. It told her that the people she loved could still be removed with a signature. Anne found her own answer inside an old cabinet at Balmoral. A folded tartan blanket rested where her mother had once kept it. She lifted it, held it for several silent seconds, then returned it exactly as she had found it. That small act strengthened her resolve. The residence, she believed, could not become an extension of Camilla's personal household simply because the old boundaries had become inconvenient. Charles now stood between them. The king understood why his sister acted, yet he also knew that allowing the order to remain unchallenged could weaken his wife inside their marriage and household. William privately shared Anne's concern, though he refused to approve her method without question. The future king believed royal residences had to remain tied to duty and direct succession, not gradually absorbed into wider family circles. Charles finally asked him the question in private. Had he known Anne intended to act? William paused, choosing every word carefully. I knew she was worried. I did not know she would close the gates. But behind that answer lay something none of them had yet discussed openly. A room, a guest list, and one object belonging to the late queen that Anne believed should never have been touched. The Balmoral order had shocked the household, but the real point of no return had happened weeks earlier, during a private visit that turned suspicion into certainty. Weeks before the gates were closed, Balmoral hosted what was supposed to be a quiet family weekend. No ceremony, no official photographs, no public duties. Yet before the visit ended, Anne walked into her mother's private morning room and stopped cold. A cabinet had been opened, personal items had been moved, and one of Camilla's relatives was holding a silver-framed photograph that had never been intended for display. In that instant, concern became confrontation. Camilla had arranged the visit as an escape from pressure. She wanted Charles surrounded by warmth, conversation, and familiar faces after months of strain inside the monarchy. The king had welcomed the idea because Balmoral had become painfully quiet, and he believed a private gathering might bring life back into a house still haunted by loss. But the Queen Consort's family had been given access to rooms that carried a meaning far deeper than comfort. Anne arrived earlier than expected after changing her travel plans. The Princess Royal quickly noticed that additional bedrooms had been opened and that staff had prepared spaces traditionally reserved for the late Queen's immediate descendants. Her concern sharpened, but she said nothing until she reached the morning room. That private space had been preserved largely as her mother left it, making every object inside feel less like property and more like unfinished memory. Anne saw one adult guest holding the framed photograph, while another examined items on the writing desk. She walked forward, took the picture carefully, and returned it to the cabinet. Her voice remained calm, but the words cut through the room. These things are not decorations. They are her life. Camilla entered moments later and immediately understood the insult her relatives had felt. She insisted that no harm had been intended and accused Anne of treating her family like intruders. The princess refused to retreat. She said intention did not erase boundaries, especially inside a room filled with private correspondence, family history, and memories that had never been offered for casual use. The argument might still have ended there. Then a staff member approached Anne privately and revealed that instructions had been given to move several boxes from the morning room into storage so the space could be used more comfortably during future visits. The boxes contained handwritten letters, personal photographs, and objects her mother had deliberately kept close. Anne felt the full danger of silence. One weekend could become a pattern. One adjustment could become permission. That evening, she opened a small notebook and wrote 3 sentences. The final line was absolute. No further private access without control. When Camilla later discovered that this weekend had become the foundation for a formal ban, she demanded a direct meeting and refused to let Charles stand between them. The wound created in that morning room could no longer remain hidden, and when the two women finally faced each other, Balmoral became the battleground for years of unspoken resentment. Camilla entered the room carrying Anne's order in one hand. There were no advisors beside her, no secretaries taking notes, and no king waiting to soften the exchange. The princess remained standing near the fireplace as the door closed behind them. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Then the Queen Consort placed the paper on the table and demanded to know how Charles' sister had acquired the authority to decide which members of her family were welcome at Balmoral. Camilla had insisted on a private meeting at Clarence's house before the dispute spread beyond the family. Clarence's house was the London residence used by Charles and his wife, but on that day it felt less like a royal home and more like a courtroom without witnesses. The Queen Consort wanted no advisors controlling her words. She wanted Anne to hear the anger directly, without palace language hiding the wound underneath it. Anne came prepared. The princess carried a list of the rooms opened during the disputed weekend, and the household instructions connected to them. She explained that the restriction was meant to protect the late queen's private spaces, not punish Camilla's relatives. But the distinction brought no comfort. Camilla's voice tightened. Her children had endured years of being treated as an embarrassment attached to her marriage, she said, while offering support whenever public pressure became unbearable. Now the Balmoral order confirmed their deepest fear. No matter how loyally she served Charles, her family would remain close enough to be useful, yet never close enough to belong. Anne did not soften. Service to the king, she replied, did not create automatic ownership of his mother's private world. The princess admitted the decision would hurt people who had not intended harm, but she refused to apologize for protecting the belongings and traditions left behind by the late monarch. Then Camilla revealed something more dangerous. Charles had personally encouraged the cancelled gathering. The king had wanted warmth, companionship, and family around him. By closing the gates, Anne had not only rejected Camilla's relatives, she had overruled her own brother's private wishes. Anne answered by producing the estate instructions, authorizing the removal of objects from the morning room. She pushed the page across the table and asked whether Camilla had known. The Queen Consort read it slowly. Her hand trembled as she set it down. She denied ordering the personal items removed, but admitted her household had approved making the room more usable. That room was not waiting to be made useful, Anne replied. Camilla rose so sharply that the chair scraped across the floor. She accused the princess of trying to make her feel temporary, as though her marriage, position, and family could vanish whenever the old bloodline chose. Anne remained seated. At Balmoral, all of us are temporary. The meeting ended without reconciliation. Camilla left the relocation order behind, but one question followed her out of the room. Anne had made the decision and defended it with absolute conviction, but did she truly possess the power to enforce it? The emotional battle had been fought. Now the outcome would depend on the hidden structure of control surrounding Balmoral itself. Camilla believed Charles could overturn the order with a sentence. Anne knew the matter was not so simple. Balmoral was bound not only by royal custom, but by a network of estate responsibilities, private family arrangements, and instructions preserved from the late queen's final years. Somewhere inside those records lay the answer to the question dividing the household. Was Anne acting out of grief, or exercising a responsibility her mother had deliberately placed in her hands? Charles began reviewing the files in private. Balmoral was the monarch's personal property, but daily access, preservation decisions, and the use of historically private rooms were controlled through estate procedures and consultation with senior family members. Those procedures were meant to stop one household from making permanent changes to spaces carrying generations of memory. What had seemed like a family argument was now becoming something far more dangerous, a test of authority. Anne's role appeared again and again in the records. During the late queen's final years, the Princess Royal had been asked to oversee practical matters involving horses, private possessions, family papers, and rooms with deep personal meaning. None of those responsibilities gave her absolute power, but together they showed trust. Her mother had not merely relied on her loyalty, she had placed delicate parts of the family legacy directly into her care. Charles read each page with growing sadness. The king could feel the deeper message beneath the formal wording. His mother had anticipated disagreement after her death. She had understood that grief would not prevent ambition, convenience, or resentment from entering the rooms she left behind. Affection alone, she seemed to believe, would not be enough. William joined his father in the library, but refused to choose a side too quickly. The prince felt sympathy for Camilla's humiliation and understood why exclusion wounded her so deeply. Yet he could not ignore what had happened in the morning room. Personal objects had been moved. Private space had been treated as available. Anne's fear no longer looked imagined. Then a sealed memorandum was found among the late queen's estate papers. A memorandum was a written instruction recording how a private matter should be handled. It named neither Camilla nor her relatives, but its message was unmistakable. Private family areas must not be repurposed for new household use, without agreement from her children and the direct heir. William read the sentence twice. Then he held the page toward Charles. The king did not take it immediately. When he finally reached for it, his voice dropped. She knew this day might come. The meaning was devastating. Anne was one of the late monarch's children, and William was the direct heir, the person next in line to inherit the crown. Their combined objection carried decisive weight under the family arrangement. Charles could still challenge them, but only by openly disregarding his mother's written preference. Power shifted in that moment. Anne's order was no longer simply an act of grief. It now stood behind the moral authority of the late queen herself. Charles had to choose whether to defend his wife, confront his sister, or remain silent, and whatever he decided would leave someone he loved feeling abandoned. The first consequence arrived not through a palace announcement, but through a telephone call. Cars had been booked, security names had been submitted, luggage was already being prepared. Then Camilla's family received a brief message informing them that the Balmoral visit would not proceed. No alternative date was offered. No detailed explanation followed. Inside Clarence's house, the Queen Consort listened as one of her children asked whether they had done something wrong and found herself unable to answer. The Balmoral household had formally withdrawn both accommodation and security clearance for the planned visit. Security clearance meant official permission for named guests to enter and stay on the estate. The reason given was the new preservation arrangement protecting the late Queen's private rooms. But everyone involved understood the real message. The weekend had not been postponed. It had been stopped. Senior aides moved quickly to contain the damage. Staff were instructed to call the cancellation a scheduling adjustment and avoid discussing family access. The phrase sounded harmless, but it concealed a permanent threat. Unless Anne's restriction was reversed, Camilla's relatives would not return under the original terms. Camilla kept her voice steady as she spoke with her son. He asked whether the decision was directed at him personally, and she immediately said no. He had done nothing wrong. Yet the strain in her answer exposed what she could not hide. She had no power to protect him from the humiliation created by the order. The Queen Consort could defend her royal position in public, but she could not guarantee her own family a room behind Balmoral's gates. Anne received confirmation that the calls had been made, and felt the weight of what followed. The Princess Royal sat before the cancelled guest list, reading names that had never ordered objects moved or demanded access. Innocent people were now carrying the pain of a battle they had not started. For one moment, her certainty weakened. Then she remembered the morning room and remained silent. Charles summoned his sister privately and asked for one final exception. The king proposed a limited visit, but Anne refused unless every protected room remained sealed, and the guest list received personal approval. Her condition was firm because the previous trust, she believed, had already been broken. Camilla rejected the compromise before it could be completed. She told Charles she would not send her family somewhere they would be watched, tolerated, and quietly suspected. After the call ended, she lifted a framed photograph of her grandchildren and held it tightly against her chest. When an aide entered, she returned it at once and requested the day's official papers. Charles later arrived at Balmoral without them. He stopped outside one of the unused rooms but did not enter. The emptiness no longer represented peace. It represented division. Then Camilla delivered the sentence that forced the crisis into its darkest stage. She would not return to Balmoral herself. With the guest rooms empty and his wife refusing to cross the threshold, Charles could no longer pretend this was an administrative dispute. It had become a test of his marriage, his sister, and his mother's final wishes. Charles found Anne alone in the late Queen's sitting room after dinner. No private secretary stood nearby. No papers separated them. The king closed the door himself and asked the question he had avoided from the beginning. Had his sister blocked Camilla's family to protect their mother, or to punish his wife? Anne looked toward the chair where the late monarch once sat, then answered with a truth that left her brother unable to respond. Anne told him she had never hated Camilla. The Princess Royal did not want her relatives humiliated, nor had she intended to turn Balmoral into a weapon against them. Her fear was quieter and, in her mind, far more dangerous. Rooms could be opened for convenience. Boxes could be moved to create space. Guest lists could expand until boundaries once treated as sacred disappeared completely. Their mother had trusted them to prevent that slow erosion. Charles listened without interruption. The king admitted that Camilla saw the restriction as final proof that she would always remain outside the deepest circle of the family. Defending his mother's wishes while his wife suffered made him feel trapped between the two defining loyalties of his life. Whatever choice he made, one woman would believe he had abandoned her. Then Charles revealed why he had encouraged the visit. Balmoral had become unbearably quiet. Every corridor reminded him of the person no longer there, and every untouched room seemed to preserve an absence he could not escape. He had imagined children and grandchildren bringing warmth back into the house. He wanted laughter where grief had settled. What he had not considered was how those changes would feel to Anne, who saw preservation not as coldness, but as love. Anne's certainty began to soften, though her position did not disappear. She explained that the ban could be changed if the late Queen's private rooms received formal protection. Future guests could stay elsewhere on the estate, but the preserved residence could not be treated as general family accommodation. She wanted a binding family agreement, an arrangement every household and future monarch would have to respect, so no one could casually alter those rooms without collective consent. Charles walked toward his mother's empty chair and rested one hand on its back. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then his voice broke through the silence. "I wanted to fill the house because I could not bear what was missing." Anne looked at him differently after that. The princess no longer saw only a king defending his wife. She saw her brother grieving in a way he had never admitted. She agreed to speak directly with Camilla and explained that the restriction was not permanent exile. Her family could still visit Balmoral, but the late Queen's preserved spaces would remain protected. For the first time, compromise became possible. Yet the private breakthrough came too late to contain the damage. The story had already escaped palace walls, and the public was about to turn Balmoral's closed gates into a national symbol of belonging, inheritance, and royal power. By sunrise, the argument belonged to everyone. Broadcasters spoke of a royal family divided by the late Queen's memory. Commentators debated whether Anne had defended tradition or humiliated the king's wife. Outside Balmoral, visitors gathered near the estate entrance beneath grey Scottish skies, staring through gates that had become the symbol of the entire conflict. One newspaper image captured the mood perfectly: Anne walking inside the grounds while Camilla's cancelled convoy never arrived. Royal coverage pushed the dispute to the center of the national conversation. The Princess Royal was presented as the guardian of her mother's legacy, while Camilla was described as a wife trying to secure a place for her own family within royal life. Buckingham Palace responded with a restrained statement, insisting that access to private royal residences remained a family matter and that no constitutional duty had been affected. A constitutional duty meant an official responsibility carried out on behalf of the state. The explanation sounded careful, but it did nothing to calm the public. One national newspaper published Balmoral's iron gates across its front page beneath the headline, "Anne draws the line." Beside it sat a smaller photograph of Camilla leaving an engagement with a tense expression. The contrast was brutal. Anne appeared decisive. The Queen Consort appeared defeated. What had begun as a private argument was now being framed as a clear victory for one woman and a public rejection of the other. A broadcaster reported live from the road outside Balmoral as a small crowd gathered. One woman held flowers in memory of the late Queen and told the camera that house was hers. Someone had to protect what she left behind. The word spread quickly because they reduced a complicated family conflict to a simple emotional judgment. Anne had protected. Camilla had crossed a line. Camilla watched the coverage beside Charles and felt herself becoming an intruder in the story of her own marriage. When a commentator called her relatives outsiders at the royal gate, she reached for the remote and switched off the television. The king tried to speak, but she stood and left before he could find the right words. Anne felt no triumph. She told William that she had acted to preserve boundaries, not to invite cruelty toward another woman's family. The prince warned her that unless the dispute was resolved visibly, the country would divide the family into two camps: the late Queen's bloodline against the king's wife. That warning changed everything. Anne agreed to meet Camilla again, this time carrying a written settlement instead of an accusation. The proposal allowed her relatives to stay in designated estate lodges while permanently protecting the late Queen's private rooms. The final decision would no longer be measured by who won access to Balmoral. It would be judged by whether two wounded women could accept a boundary without turning it into lifelong rejection. With the public demanding a victor, they returned to the same table, not to reopen the battle, but to decide whether memory and belonging could exist without destroying each other. The final agreement contained no dramatic apology and no triumphant reversal. Anne did not withdraw her protection of the late Queen's residence, and Camilla did not accept that her family should be treated as unwelcome. Instead, the two women drew a boundary neither could ignore. The private rooms remained sealed to informal use. Camilla's relatives would stay elsewhere on the estate when invited. Balmoral would welcome them, but the late Queen's home would not be remade around them. Charles approved the family arrangement alongside Anne, Camilla, and William. The agreement separated the late Queen's preserved residence from guest accommodation elsewhere on the Balmoral estate. Camilla's children and grandchildren could still visit designated lodges and shared areas when invited, but they could not occupy, alter, or privately use the late monarch's rooms. Anne met Camilla without aids. The Princess Royal acknowledged that the abrupt cancellation had caused humiliation and made innocent relatives feel rejected. She did not apologize for protecting her mother's rooms, but she admitted the decision had been delivered too coldly. The Queen Consort accepted the boundary, then made one demand. Her family must never again learn of restrictions through staff. She expected direct respect, not distant management. Anne placed the agreement between them. Camilla read the final page, picked up the pen, and signed. Neither woman smiled. Yet when the Queen Consort rose, the princess opened the door herself, rather than leaving the gesture to an aide. The gesture ended the language of exclusion. Charles later entered the preserved morning room with Anne. The king found everything unchanged. The silver-framed photograph stood inside the cabinet, exactly where his sister had returned it after the incident that started the crisis. He knew Anne had not been defending furniture or ceremony. She had been defending memory. Camilla chose to return to Balmoral with Charles, staying elsewhere on the estate and respecting the protected rooms. It proved accepting a boundary did not mean accepting humiliation. Anne had not defeated her, and she had not conquered Balmoral. The victory belonged to restraint. Charles closed the morning room door after one final look. Anne waited beside him while Camilla stood nearby. The king turned the key, not to exclude his wife but to preserve his mother's world. Together, they walked away, leaving the room unchanged and the conflict settled. Balmoral remained what the late queen intended, not a prize to inherit, but a sacred family memory, protected by those strong enough to draw a line and wise enough to stop that line from becoming a permanent wound. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.